the world through sound before she ever learned it through words. The kitchen of Blackridge Hold had a language all its own. The pop and hiss of fat hitting the hearthstone, the low groan of the bread oven's iron door, the wet thud of dough on the floured table, and the dry scrape of a knife drawn across a cutting board, and the particular ringing silence that followed when someone dropped something and was deciding whether to blame her for it. Seren knew every voice in Blackridge by its weight and its edges. She knew Petra's voice, low and warm and rough as a wool blanket, from 20 paces down the corridor. She knew the head cook's voice, sharp and thin and always slightly too loud, and she knew to step left when she heard it coming because the head cook never moved for anyone. She knew the bootfall of every guard on the lower level, the particular creak of the third step on the cellar stair, and the exact number of paces from her pallet in the corner of the kitchen storeroom to the well in the courtyard. 47, she had counted them 1,000 times. She did not know what she looked like. Petra had told her once. Dark hair, pale eyes, a face that would be pretty if the eyes worked, and then had gone quiet in that particular way that meant she wished she had not said anything. Seren had not asked again. She knew her own hands well enough, the calluses on her fingertips from years of washing and peeling and scrubbing, the small burn scar on her right wrist from the time she had misjudged the distance to the stove. She knew the shape of her own face by touch, the way her hair fell in loose waves that Petra braided each morning, and that always came undone by midday. She was 22 years old. She had been blind since the moment she was born, and she had never once left the walls of Blackridge Hold. No one talked about this, the way no one talked about the crack in the great hall's hearthstone, or the damp that crept through the eastern wall each autumn. Some things simply were. Seren was blind. Seren was an omega. Seren worked in the kitchens because the kitchens were warm and the work could be done by touch, and no one had to look at her milky, sightless eyes and feel whatever it was they felt. Pity or discomfort or the low crawl of superstition that said a blind omega was bad luck, a curse, a sign that the pack had done something wrong and the old gods had marked them for it. Alpha Odin did not believe in the old gods, but he believed in appearances, and a blind omega who could not hunt, could not fight, could not be mated to anyone of standing, could not be displayed at a claiming ceremony without drawing whispers and sideways glances. That was an appearance he could do without. So Seren stayed in the kitchens, and the kitchen stayed warm. And the world beyond the walls of Blackridge Hold remained a collection of sounds carried in on the boots and cloaks of people who could see it. She was elbow deep in a basin of cold water, scrubbing the soot from an iron pot when Petra came through the kitchen door. Seren knew it was Petra before the door had fully opened. The rhythm of her step, left foot slightly heavier than the right, an old injury that Petra refused to discuss, and the faint smell of dried herbs that clung to her clothes. "The Alpha King is coming," Petra said. The kitchen went quiet, not silent, and the fire still crackled, the bread oven still groaned, but the human sounds stopped. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly. Seren tilted her head. "When?" 3 days. He's riding through the northern territories. Autumn claiming. Petra's voice was careful in the way it became when she was choosing which truths to say and which to leave in her throat. Every unclaimed omega of age is to be presented in his great hall. Every unclaimed omega, Seren repeated. Petra did not answer immediately. In the silence, Seren heard the head cook shift her weight. heard a kitchen girl set down a ladle very gently, heard the particular quality of hell breath that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. "Not you," Petra said finally. "Alpha Odin has decided. You will stay below during the ceremony. In the root cellar." Serene's hands went still in the cold water. The pot settled against the basin with a dull ring. She had known this. Of course she had known this. She had known it the way she knew the walls, by running her hands along them in the dark until the shape of the thing became familiar, until the edges stopped surprising her. She was not something Odin Blackridge wanted the Alpha King to see. She had never been something anyone wanted to see. "The root cellar," she said, and her voice was steady and her hands were still in the cold water, and something behind her ribs had gone very quiet. "I will bring you food," Petra said. "And a candle." She stopped. The word hung in the air between them like a thing with edges. "A blanket," Petra corrected softly. "I will bring you a blanket." Seren nodded. She went back to scrubbing the pot. The soot came off in long black streaks under her fingernails, and the water went dark, and she scrubbed until her hands ached, because the ache in her hands was simpler than the ache behind her ribs. 3 days. The Alpha King was coming in 3 days, and she would spend those days in a dark hole beneath the kitchens. And no one, not one person in Blackridge Hold, would think this strange, because Seren had spent her entire life in a kind of cellar, and this was simply the one with a door that locked from the outside. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about this particular thing a long time ago. Instead, she finished the pot, set it on the drying rack by touch, dried her hands on the rough kitchen cloth, and walked the 47 paces to the well in the courtyard. She stood there in the late afternoon and felt the autumn sun on her face. She could always feel the sun, warm and directionless, and she could feel the wind, which came from the north and carried the smell of pine and cold stone and the faintest edge of something she could not name, something vast and open that she thought might be the sky. She tilted her face up toward the warmth. The wind moved her hair. Somewhere above her, a bird was calling, a sharp, repeating note that she had never been able to match to a name. This was the whole of her world, 47 paces and a square of open sky she could not see. The 3 days passed the way days always passed in Blackridge, in sounds and textures and the slow rotation of tasks. Seren peeled root vegetables by touch, her knife moving in quick, sure strokes that the kitchen girls watched with a kind of uneasy fascination. She kneaded bread, punching the dough down and folding it over with a rhythm that Petra had taught her when she was 7 years old. She swept the storeroom floor, counting the strokes, and she mended a tear in her own dress by feel, the needle finding the fabric's edge with the accuracy of long practice. On the morning of the 3rd day, Petra came to the storeroom before dawn. Seren was already awake. She had heard the hold coming alive in the darkness. More feet than usual on the upper floors, the scrape of furniture being moved in the great hall, the low, urgent voices of people preparing for an inspection they could not afford to fail. "It is time," Petra said. Her voice was tight in a way that meant she had not slept. Seren rose from her pallet. She had already dressed, a plain gray wool dress, clean but faded, the hem let out twice. She had braided her own hair in the dark, and the braid was crooked, and she did not care. Petra took her hand. Seren let herself be led down the narrow stone stairs to the cellar level, through the low corridor that smelled of damp stone and old ale, past the storage rooms where the autumn grain was kept, to the root cellar at the far end. The door was heavy oak with an iron latch. Petra opened it. The air inside was cold and still and smelled of earth and onions and the dry, papery scent of stored turnips. "There is a stool in the back corner," Petra said, "against the left wall, and I have put a blanket on it." Seren stepped inside. She found the stool by touch, rough wood, splintered at one leg, and the blanket folded on top of it. She sat down. The blanket was the one from Petra's own bed. She knew it by the smell. "I will come back as soon as the ceremony is over," Petra said from the doorway. "It will not be long, a few hours." "You should go," Seren said. "They will need you upstairs." Petra hesitated. Seren could hear her breathing, the slightly ragged quality of it, the way it caught at the top of each inhale. "This is wrong," Petra said quietly. "What they are doing to you is wrong." "Go," Seren said, "before someone notices." The door closed. The iron latch clicked into place from the outside. And then there was only the dark. Not that this mattered to Seren, because the dark was where she had always lived, but the sound of it mattered. The particular quality of enclosed silence that was different from the kitchen's warm noise, different from the courtyard's open air. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. She listened. Through stone and wood and the length of the corridor, she could hear the faintest sounds of the hold above. Boots on flagstone, the distant murmur of voices, the low groan of the great hall doors being opened. The Alpha King had arrived. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and settled in to wait. She heard the ceremony begin through the stone. It was muffled, voices flattened to low hums, individual words lost, but she could hear the rhythm of it. A deep voice speaking, then silence, then another voice answering. The claiming ceremony. She had heard the older Omegas talk about it in the kitchens, their voices dropping to whispers as though the words themselves were fragile. The unclaimed Omegas would stand in a line in the great hall. The visiting Alpha, in this case the Alpha King himself, would walk the line. He would stop before each one. He would speak. They would answer. And if the wolf in him recognized the wolf in them, if the bond pull ignited, if the scent and the voice and the presence of the other struck something deep in the marrow, then the claiming was made. Seren had never stood in a claiming line. She had never been permitted to. She sat on her stool in the root cellar and listened to the muffled sounds of the ceremony and tried to feel nothing about it. She was moderately successful. The blanket helped. The smell of Petra's bed, herbs and wool, and a faint trace of the lavender oil she rubbed into her bad knee each evening was a small anchor in the dark. Time passed. She could not tell how much. She counted her own breaths for a while, then stopped, then counted them again. She heard bootsteps past the cellar door twice. Guards, she thought, by the weight of them. They did not stop. Then she heard something else. It was distant at first, a sound from the great hall above, carrying through the stone in fragments. A voice, deep, low, and steady with a quality she had never heard before. Not loud, not commanding in the way Odern's voice was commanding, sharp and thin and edged with the need to be obeyed, but commanding in the way that stone is commanding or the way deep water is commanding. It carried without effort. It filled whatever space it entered. She found herself leaning forward on the stool, tilting her head toward the ceiling, as though she could hear more clearly if she just got a little closer to the stone above. The Alpha King. That was the Alpha King's voice. She could not make out the words, only the sound, the low, steady resonance of it. The way it moved through stone like stone was nothing. Like walls were suggestions and distance was a courtesy the voice was choosing not to observe. She had never heard a voice travel like that. She had spent her entire life cataloging voices, sorting them by weight and texture and the shape of the mouth that made them. And this voice was unlike anything in her collection. It sounded, she thought, like what warmth would sound like if warmth could speak. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall. The stone was cold. The voice moved through it anyway. And then the ceremony ended. She heard the shift, the collective release of held breath, the shuffle of feet, the rise of many voices speaking at once. The claiming was done. Someone had been claimed, or no one had. She would hear about it later in the kitchen, from the girls who would talk about the Alpha King's shoulders and the Alpha King's eyes, and the Alpha King's wolf while they peeled turnips and pretended they were not heartbroken. She leaned back against the wall. Petra would come soon. The cellar door would open, and Seren would climb the stairs, and the Alpha King would leave, and everything would go on being exactly what it had always been. But the door did not open. Minutes passed, or hours. She could not tell, not without the kitchen's rhythms to anchor her. The muffled sounds from above changed in character. Voices were sharper now. Something was happening. That was not the ceremony. She heard Odin's voice. She always knew Odin's voice, thin and tight and controlled. And it was not controlled now. It was high, it was defensive, and beneath it, steady as the stone itself, the deep voice of the Alpha King. They were arguing. The realization settled into her slowly like water seeping through cracks in a wall. The Alpha King and Odin Blackridge were arguing about something, and the argument was not quiet, and it was coming closer. Bootsteps in the corridor. Heavy, purposeful, not the guard's measured patrol, but the stride of a man who was going somewhere specific and did not intend to be stopped. Behind them, lighter and faster, almost running, Odin's step, she realized. She knew it from a lifetime of listening. The quick, precise clip of a man who was always slightly too fast, as though stillness was a weakness he could not afford. "Your Majesty, please. This is the lower cellar. There is nothing here but stores. Then you will not mind if I look." The deep voice, close now, on the other side of the corridor, and the sound of it, unadorned, unhurried, absolutely certain, sent a shock through her chest that she did not understand. She had heard it from above, through stone, and it had been remarkable. Heard from 10 feet away, with only a wooden door between them, it was something else entirely. The bootsteps stopped, right outside the root cellar door. Serene's hands gripped the edges of the stool. She was holding her breath. She could hear Odin behind the door, his breathing quick and shallow, and she could hear the Alpha King breathing, slow, deep, steady, and she could hear her own heart, which was doing something it had never done before, beating in a rhythm that felt less like fear and more like recognition. "Open this door." 3 words. Quiet. The kind of quiet that does not need volume because it has weight instead. "Your Majesty, it is a root cellar, turnips, onions, nothing of interest." I did not ask what was in it. I said open the door. A silence. Serene could hear Odin's throat working, the dry click of a man swallowing his own objections. Then the iron latch scraped, the oak door groaned on its hinges, and the cellar filled with the scent of the corridor, cold stone, old ale, and beneath it something new. Pine, deep, dark pine, not the thin, sharp scent of pine needles, but the rich, heavy scent of the heartwood itself. And beneath the pine, smoke, and beneath the smoke, something warm, something animal, something that was not quite human and not quite wolf, but somewhere in the space between, the place where the shift lived. Seren had never smelled anything like it. She had catalogued every scent in Blackridge Hold, the bread oven's yeast, the courtyard's rain-wet stone, Petra's lavender, the sharp mineral tang of the well water. And this scent did not belong to Blackridge. It belonged to somewhere vast and open and achingly alive. She was still sitting on the stool. The blanket was still around her shoulders. Her hands were still gripping the stool's edges, and her milky gray-blue eyes were open and aimed at nothing, the way they always were, because she had never learned to close them when she was not sleeping. She heard him step into the cellar. One step. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He was heavy, broad, the kind of heavy that comes from muscle and bone rather than excess. She heard his breathing change, a sharp, short inhale through the nose, the kind of breath a wolf takes when it catches a scent. Then silence. The silence was enormous. It filled the cellar the way his voice had filled the corridor, completely, leaving no room for anything else. Seren sat in it and felt the blood moving through her veins and the air moving through her lungs and the steady, impossible heat of his presence, 6 feet away from her. And she understood, in the way that she understood all things, by touch, by sound, by the shape of the absence around the thing itself, that something had just changed. Something fundamental. Something that could not be put back. "Your name," he said. Not a demand, not a question exactly. Something between the two. A word spoken into a dark room by a man who had come a very long way to say it. Seren opened her mouth. Her lips were dry. She wet them. "Seren," she said. "And the Alpha King, Cormac Vellanthor, ruler of the Northern Territories, a man whose voice moved through stone, exhaled." It was a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. Not a sigh, not a groan, not a gasp. An exhale. The sound of a man setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. "Seren," he repeated, and her name in his mouth was different from her name in anyone else's mouth. It was warmer, it had weight. It sounded like a word that meant something. Not just a label attached to a blind girl in a cellar, but a name, a real name, a name that belonged to a person who mattered. She heard Odern behind him in the doorway. She heard the pack Alpha's breath, tight, rapid, the breath of a man whose careful arrangements were falling apart. "She is, Your Majesty, she is defective. She has been blind since birth. She cannot hunt. She cannot fight. She is of no use to—" "Get out." 2 words, quiet, the same quiet as before, the kind that has weight instead of volume, the kind that does not ask twice. Odern got out. His bootsteps retreated down the corridor, fast and uneven, and the sound of them grew smaller until there was nothing left but the cellar and the cold, and the scent of pine and smoke, and the enormous, world-altering presence of the man standing 6 feet away from her. "You are cold," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Seren said. "How long have you been down here?" "I do not know. Since before this ceremony." Another silence. This one had a different quality. Harder, darker, a silence with teeth. She heard something shift in his breathing, a controlled tension that she recognized from a lifetime of listening to people who were angry and choosing not to show it. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "Will you come with me?" She should have hesitated. She knew that, even then, knew that a sensible person would ask questions, would demand explanations, would not simply stand up and follow a stranger's voice out of a cellar. But she had lived her entire life in a world made of sound, and she had learned to trust sound the way sighted people trusted sight. And the sound of this man's voice, the weight of it, the steadiness, the way it arrived in her chest, like something that had always been there and was only now making itself known, was the truest thing she had ever heard. She stood. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. She did not reach for it. "I cannot see," she said, because it needed to be said, even though he already knew. "I cannot see the stairs. I cannot see the corridor. I cannot see you." "I know," he said. And then, "May I take your hand?" he asked. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to pinpoint the exact moment it began. He asked. He did not grab, did not steer, did not take her elbow, the way people always took her elbow. A grip that meant, "I am in control of where you go." He asked if he could take her hand, as though her hand were hers to give and not his to take. "Yes," she said. His hand closed around hers. It was large and warm and rough with calluses. Different calluses from hers, not the kitchen-worn smoothness of scrubbed skin. but the hard ridges of a man who held a sword and ran on 4 legs through wild country. His palm was hot against hers. She could feel his pulse in the web between his thumb and forefinger, strong and steady. He led her out of the cellar. He did not pull. He walked at her pace, and when they reached the stairs, he said, 7 steps going up. I will go first. Hold the rail on your left. She held the rail. She climbed the stairs. His hand stayed in hers, warm and certain, and the scent of pine and smoke surrounded her, and the sound of his breathing was steady beside her, and she climbed out of the dark place they had kept her in, and felt the air change, warmer, wider, the faint draft from a window somewhere above, and she knew she was in the corridor above the cellars, and she knew she would not go back down. The great hall of Blackridge was full of sound. Seren heard it before they reached it. The murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the particular hushed quality that meant a room full of people was trying very hard to pretend it was not staring. They were staring. She knew they were. She could feel it, the way she could feel sunlight, a pressure on her skin, directionless and warm, except this was not warm. This was the cold pressure of many eyes on a thing they did not expect to see. Cormac did not slow down. His hand stayed around hers, steady and unhurried, and he walked through the great hall the way his voice moved through stone, with a certainty that made obstacles irrelevant. She heard the crowd part for him. She heard the whispers begin. Small, sharp sounds like dry leaves blown across flagstone. Blind. That one. The one from the kitchens. Why is she... Cormac stopped. She felt the halt ripple up through his hand into hers. A sudden stillness that was different from standing still. A stillness that meant he had heard the whispers too and was choosing how to respond to them. He chose silence. It was, she would learn, his preferred weapon. He stood in the center of the great hall with her hand in his, and he said nothing, and the whispers died the way fire dies when you take away its air. Then he spoke, not to the crowd, not to the pack, to one man. Odern Blackridge. Seren heard the pack alpha's steps, quick, clicking, crossing the flagstone from somewhere to her left. She heard him stop. She heard his breathing. It was the breathing of a man standing on a ledge. Your Majesty, how many unclaimed omegas of age do you have in this hold? A pause. The kind of pause that contains a lie being assembled. 7, Your Majesty, as presented in the ceremony. 8. One word, heavy with arithmetic. Your Majesty, I am not certain what... You have 8 unclaimed omegas of age. 7 were presented. 1 was locked in a root cellar beneath your kitchens with a blanket and a stool and a door that latches from the outside. Cormac's voice had not changed in volume. It had not changed in tone, but it had changed in temperature. It was colder now. I want to know why. The hall was so silent that Seren could hear the fire cracking in the great hearth 20 paces away. She could hear Odern's tongue move across his dry lips. She is blind, Your Majesty. She has been blind since birth. It was a mercy. The ceremony would have been distressing for her. She cannot see. She would not have understood. She is standing beside me, Cormac said. You may stop speaking about her as though she is not. Seren felt something shift in the room. Not a sound, a vibration, a tension, the collective held breath of every person in Blackridge who had ever walked past her in the kitchen corridor without seeing her, without wanting to see her. She is, Your Majesty, with respect, she is not suitable for... That is not your decision. Cormac's hand tightened fractionally around hers. Not a squeeze. A signal. I am here. I am not leaving. This omega was hidden from the claiming ceremony in violation of the king's law. She was locked in a cellar without light or warmth or company. She was denied the right that every omega of age is afforded, the right to be seen, to be spoken to be given the chance that the bond might find her. His voice was still quiet, still steady, still that same deep stone-passing resonance. Do you understand what I am telling you, Blackridge? Your Majesty, I am telling you that I found my mate in your root cellar. The silence that followed was not like the other silences. This one had a sound, a collective intake of breath, a gasp that moved through the hall like wind through dry grass. Seren felt it on her skin. She felt Cormac's pulse jump once in the web of his hand, and then settle, strong and sure. His mate. She was his mate. The bond pull, that thing the Omegas whispered about in the kitchen, that thing she had heard described 100 times and never expected to feel, was the warmth that had entered her chest when she first heard his voice through the stone. It was the shock that moved through her when he stepped into the cellar. It was the recognition, bone deep and undeniable, that had made her stand up and take his hand and follow him out of the dark without asking a single question. She had not known what it was because no one had ever told her what it would feel like. They had not bothered because they assumed she would never need to know. "She will come with me to Vellanthor," Cormac said. The words were addressed to Odin, but they were spoken to the room. "She will be given the care and the respect she should have received here, and you, Blackridge, will present yourself at the high seat within the season to answer for this." He did not wait for a response. His hand shifted in hers, not pulling, just adjusting, making room for her fingers to grip more comfortably. And he walked. She walked with him. Through the silent hall, past the staring crowd, past the fire that crackled and spat, through the great doors that someone opened for them, and out into the courtyard. The air hit her face, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of horses and leather and the open northern sky. She gasped. Not from the cold, from the openness. She had been in the courtyard 1,000 times, but she had always been alone in it, always within the 47 paces between the storeroom and the well. Now the courtyard was full of sounds she did not recognize. The stamp and blow of horses, the creak of leather saddles, the low voices of men who had ridden a long way and were waiting to ride back. "You are shaking," Cormac said. He had stopped walking. She could feel him standing close, close enough that his warmth cut through the autumn air, but not so close that he pressed against her. Even now, even in this, he left her the space to step back if she chose. "I am cold," she said. It was partially true. "And the rest?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I have never been outside the walls," she said. "Not once in my life. I do not know what is beyond the gates. I do not know what the road sounds like, or what a river sounds like, or what the forest sounds like when it is not behind stone. I have never—" Her voice broke. She pressed her lips together until the trembling stopped. "I have never heard any of it." His hand was still in hers. He did not let go. "Then you will hear it now," he said. They brought her a cloak. It was one of the king's, far too large, heavy, dark wool, lined with thick fur that was softer than anything she had ever touched. It smelled of pine and smoke and him. Someone draped it over her shoulders, and the weight of it settled around her like an embrace. And she pulled it close and breathed in the scent of it, and for the first time in 22 years, the cold could not reach her. She could not ride. She had never been on a horse. Cormac solved this without discussion. He lifted her onto his own horse, a massive destrier whose sides she could feel breathing against her legs, and he mounted behind her, and his arms came around her to hold the reins, and his chest was against her back, broad and warm and solid, and she was surrounded by the scent and sound and warmth of him. "We ride north," he said, his voice close above her head. 3 days to Vellanthor. I will tell you everything we pass." And he did. He told her about the road, wide and packed dirt, lined with birch trees whose leaves were going gold. He told her about the hills that rose to the west, dark with pine, and the river that ran parallel to the road, shallow and fast over smooth stones. He told her about the sky, overcast, gray, the kind of gray that promises snow before nightfall, and the birds that wheeled above the tree line, and the way the light fell through the clouds in long, pale shafts that touched the hilltops and left the valleys in shadow. He told her all of this in his low, steady voice, and she listened with her whole body, and the world opened around her like a door she had not known existed. She heard the river, before he described it, a low rushing sound, constant and layered, different from any water she had known. The well in the courtyard had been a single note, the splash of the bucket, the drip of the chain. This was a symphony. She turned her face toward it and felt the mist on her skin. "That is the Ashfall River," Cormac said. "It comes down from the Grey Peak Mountains. In spring, it floods the valley. In winter, it freezes in sheets. Right now, it is—" He paused. She felt his chest shift against her back as he looked. "Right now, it is the color of dark iron, and the stones in the shallows are amber, and there is a heron standing on the far bank watching us, as though it is deciding whether we are worth its attention." "What does a heron look like?" she asked. He told her. He described the long gray legs, the curved neck, the sharp beak, the patience of a bird that stood in cold water for hours, waiting for a fish to make a mistake. He described it the way no one had ever described anything to her. Not in the flat, careful terms of someone trying to be kind to a blind girl, but in the rich, specific language of someone who wanted her to have it. The whole of it. Every detail. She pressed her back against his chest and felt his voice move through her, and the road unspooled beneath the horse's hooves, and the world was vast and cold and achingly beautiful, and she was in it for the first time. They stopped at nightfall. A camp. She heard the sound of tents being raised, the crackle of a fire being built, the low voices of the king's guard arranging the watch. Cormac's second, a man called Fen, whose voice was quiet and whose step was light and careful, brought her food, bread and dried meat, and an apple, and sat with her while Cormac spoke with his men. "He has not stopped talking since we left Blackridge," Fen said. There was amusement in his voice, dry, understated, the kind of amusement that comes from knowing someone very well and being surprised by them anyway. "In 10 years of service, I have never heard him say this many words in a single day." "He was telling me about the road," Seren said. "I know," Fen said. "He described a rock formation for 20 minutes. I have ridden past that rock formation 100 times. I have never once looked at it." Seren smiled. It was a small smile, and it surprised her. The muscles in her face felt unused, as though smiling was something she had forgotten how to do properly. When Cormac returned, he did not sit beside her. He sat across the fire from her, and she could feel the distance, and she understood it. He was giving her space. He was giving her the choice to close the distance or to keep it, because he had spent less than a day with her, and he already understood the thing that had taken most people at Blackridge her entire lifetime to fail to learn, that she was a person, and persons get to choose. "There is a tent for you," he said. Fen set it closest to the fire, the flap ties from the inside. From the inside. A door that locked from the inside, the opposite of every door she had known. "Thank you," she said. She slept that night in the tent, wrapped in the too large fur-lined cloak that smelled of pine and smoke, and she listened to the fire and the wind and the distant river, and for the first time in her life, the sounds of the world were not muffled by stone walls, and she fell asleep hearing the open sky. Vellanthor was sound. She heard it before the horse crested the final hill, a vast, layered hum of life, not the closed, echoing sounds of Blackridge, where every noise bounced off stone walls and came back flattened and familiar. This was open, this was wide, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shout of a merchant in what must have been a market. Children, actual children, laughing, their voices high and bright and completely unself-conscious. Dogs barking, the creak of cartwheels on cobblestone, and beneath it all, a low, constant sound that she could not identify, a deep, resonant hum, like the earth itself was breathing. "The falls," Cormac said, as though he had heard her question before she asked it. "The Grey Peak Falls. They come down the cliff face at the northern edge of the hold. In winter they freeze. In spring they are so loud you cannot hear yourself think." "I have never heard a waterfall," Seren said. "You will hear this one," he said. "It shakes the windows." They rode through the gates. She heard the guards call out, sharp, formal greetings that softened when they recognized their king, and she heard the shift in the crowd's noise, the ripple of attention that moved through the market like a stone dropped in water. Whispers. She was used to whispers, but these were different. These were curious, not cruel. Cormac dismounted first. She felt the horse shift beneath her as his weight left it, and then his hands were at her waist. "May I?" And she nodded, and he lifted her down. She was light in his hands. She felt the cobblestones through the thin soles of her shoes, uneven and real, and nothing like the smooth flagstone of Blackridge's kitchen. "Fen will show you to your rooms," Cormac said. "I must speak with the council, but I will come to you this evening if you permit it." If she permitted it, "I permit it," she said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. Fen led her through the hold. He was good at it, better than most. He walked at her pace. He told her the turns before they came. "Left here, 3 steps down. The corridor widens. There is a tapestry on the right wall. You can feel the edge of it if you reach out." He did not grab her elbow. He offered his arm and she took it, and he guided her through the hold with the quiet competence of a man who paid attention to how things were built. The rooms were on the 3rd floor of the eastern wing. Fen opened the door and described the space. A bed against the far wall, wide, with heavy furs and wool blankets. A fireplace to the right, already lit. She could feel the heat and hear the crackle. A window to the left, tall with heavy shutters, a table and chair near the fire, a basin of water on a stand near the door, a chest for her things, though she had no things. And the door, Fen said. He took her hand and guided it to the latch. Her fingers found the mechanism, an iron bolt, heavy and solid, set into the door at waist height. She slid it closed. It locked with a sound that went through her like a bell. It locks from the inside, she said. Yes, Fen said. The king's instruction. He left her alone. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, building the space in her mind. 4 paces from the door to the bed, 3 paces from the bed to the fireplace, 5 paces from the fireplace to the window. She touched everything, the rough wool of the blankets, the smooth stone of the hearth, the cold glass of the window. She pressed her palm against it and felt the vibration of the falls, that deep, constant hum transmitted through the stone and glass and into her bones. She found the basin and washed her hands and her face, and the water was warm, and someone had put a sprig of something in it. Rosemary, she thought, bruised and fragrant. She sat on the bed. The mattress was soft, softer than anything she had slept on. She ran her hands over the furs and found them thick and dense and warm. She put her face in her hands and she cried. Not from sadness, not from fear, from the sheer, overwhelming weight of being treated as though she were a person who deserved warm water and a soft bed and a door that locked from the inside. She cried because the room smelled of rosemary and wood smoke and not onions and damp stone, and because the falls were humming in the walls, and because a man she had known for less than 2 days had described a heron for her and asked before he took her hand and lifted her down from his horse with hands that were careful and strong and nothing like the hands that had gripped her elbow and steered her through the kitchens of Blackridge for 22 years. She cried until she was empty. Then she washed her face again. Then she braided her hair, crooked as always. Then she sat by the fire and listened to the hold come alive around her. Footsteps in the corridor, voices from the courtyard below, the falls, always the falls, steady and vast and real. Cormac came that evening. He knocked first. She heard his knuckles on the oak, 2 steady raps, unhurried, and then his voice. Seren, it is Cormac. May I come in? She unbolted the door. She heard him step inside, 1 step, then stop, giving her space, giving her the room to choose how close. I have spoken with the council, he said. They know who you are. They know what you are to me. There were questions. There are always questions, but they are answered. What kind of questions? She asked. The kind that come from men who think a mate should be chosen from a political list. She heard the faint edge of something in his voice. Not anger exactly, but the residue of anger, the way a room smells of smoke after the fire is out. I did not choose you from a list. The bond is not a negotiation. And the questions about me being blind? He was quiet for a moment. She heard him breathe. 1 slow, measured breath. They were questions, he said. I answered them. How? I told them that you heard me coming from the other side of a stone wall, that you counted the stairs without being told how many there were, that you identified the rosemary in the basin by scent alone, that you know every person in this corridor by the sound of their step. He paused. I told them that you see more than anyone I have ever met. You simply do not use your eyes to do it. She said nothing. Her throat was tight, and the fire was warm on her face, and his voice was close and deep and steady, and she did not trust herself to speak without crying again. I have also sent word to Blackridge, he said. Petra, the woman who cared for you, she is being brought here. She should arrive within the week. Serene's hand went to her mouth. She pressed her fingers against her lips and held the sound inside, the small, broken sound of a person who has just been given something they were afraid to want. You did not have to do that, she said. She raised you, Cormac said. She is your family. I will not separate you from your family. He did not stay long. He seemed to understand, as with the same instinct that had led him to the cellar door, that had made him ask before taking her hand, that she needed time to learn the shape of this new world, time to trust that the door would stay unlocked, that the room would stay warm, that the voice on the other side of the wall would still be there in the morning. I will come again tomorrow, he said. There is a garden on the south side of the hold. The autumn plantings are still growing. I thought... He stopped. She heard him shift his weight, the creak of leather, the faint sound of a man who was not accustomed to uncertainty. I thought you might like to touch them. The plants? She asked. Yes, and the trees. There is a rowan tree that is older than the hold. Its bark feels like— He paused again. I do not know how to describe how bark feels. I have never tried. Try, she said. Rough, he said, but not evenly rough. It has ridges like furrows in a field, and between the ridges there are smooth places where the rain has worn it down, and the trunk is warm on the south side, where the sun hits it, and cold on the north side, where it does not. She was smiling. She could feel it, the pull of muscles that had been so unused that morning and were now working overtime. Tomorrow, she said. The garden. He left. She bolted the door behind him and stood with her hand on the iron bolt and listened to his footsteps retreat down the corridor, steady, heavy, unhurried, and she held the sound of them in her chest like a small, warm coal. The days that followed were unlike any days she had known. She learned Vellanthor the way she had learned Blackridge, by counting paces, by memorizing turns, by touching walls and door frames and railings until the hold assembled itself in her mind like a map drawn in texture and sound. But Vellanthor was larger than Blackridge, and richer and louder, and it took her weeks to build the whole of it in her head. Cormac was there every day, not constantly, and he was the Alpha King, and the duties of the high seat did not pause for new mates, but consistently. Every morning he came to her door and knocked, and said her name and asked if she would walk with him. Every morning she unbolted the door and took his offered arm and let him lead her through the hold, and he described everything they passed. He was getting better at describing things for touch. The rowan tree's bark. The stone of the courtyard wall, different from the stone inside, rougher, pitted by rain. The wool of the tapestries in the great hall, thick, raised in patterns she could trace with her fingertips, battles and hunts and wolves running through forests she had never seen. The garden became their place. It was enclosed, a walled square on the south side of the hold, sheltered from the wind. The autumn plantings were still green, and Cormac led her along the rows and named everything she touched. Sage, thyme, late rosemary, woody-stemmed and fragrant, winter kale, broad-leafed and coarse, and the rowan tree, its trunk exactly as he had described, ridged and smooth and warm on the south side. She spent hours there. She sat on a stone bench beneath the rowan and listened to the falls and the birds and the wind in the upper branches, and she touched the leaves that fell into her lap, learning their shapes, the rowan's small serrated leaves, the kale's broad heavy ones, the sage's soft powdery surface. Petra arrived on the 7th day. Seren heard her before the door opened. That specific rhythm, left foot heavier than the right, and she was on her feet and across the room before Petra had finished climbing the stairs. They met in the corridor. Petra's arms came around her, and she smelled lavender and herbs and wool, and the older woman was shaking, and Seren was shaking, and neither of them spoke for a long time because some things are beyond the reach of words and have to be held instead. He sent a guard for me, Petra said when she could speak. An armed escort, with a letter bearing the king's seal. She pulled back and held Seren's face in her hands. A letter, for me, from the Alpha King, asking if I would come to Vellanthor to be near you. He asked, Seren said. He asked, Petra repeated, and her voice cracked on the word, and she pulled Seren close again. Petra was given rooms on the same corridor. She was given a position in the hold's herb garden, a place where her knowledge of plants and medicines could be used, not hidden. She was given a seat at the lower table in the great hall, and food that was not scraps, and a door that locked from the inside. The doors here all lock from the inside, Petra told Seren that evening, her voice wondering. Every single one. The weeks turned, and autumn deepened, and the falls grew louder as the rains came, and Seren began to understand what it meant to be seen by a man who did not need her to use her eyes to do it. Cormac never reached for her without announcing himself first. He never entered a room without knocking. He never moved furniture without telling her. He learned the things she needed, consistency, predictability, the assurance that the world would be where she left it. And he provided them without being asked, without making a performance of it, without ever once making her feel that her needs were a burden or a complication or a thing to be managed. He brought her things to touch, a piece of driftwood from the river, smooth and gray and shaped by water, a pine cone from the high forest, the scales sharp and precise beneath her fingertips, a piece of raw amber, golden, Cormac said, though golden meant nothing to her until he said, the color of warmth, the color of the sun on your face. She kept these things on the table by the fire. Her collection of the world, small, tactile pieces of a place she could not see but could hold in her hands. He told her about the wolf. They were in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the rowan. The air was cold. Winter was coming, and the last of the autumn plantings had been harvested, and the garden was bare, except for the tree and the bench and the frost that Seren could feel on the stone beneath her hands. "You have not asked about the shift," he said. "I was waiting for you to tell me." She heard him exhale, that sound she remembered from the cellar, the sound of a man setting something down. "I was not certain how to. The wolf is—" He stopped. She felt his weight shift on the bench. "Sighted people see the wolf and understand it immediately. It is large. It is powerful. It is frightening if you have reason to be frightened by it. But you cannot see it. And I do not know how to give it to you in words." "Then do not give it to me in words," she said. Silence. The falls hummed in the distance. The wind moved through the bare branches of the rowan above. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Shift," she said. "Let me hear it. Let me touch it." He was quiet for a long time. She could hear his breathing, slower than usual, deeper, the way it sounded when he was considering something carefully. She could hear his heartbeat too, or rather she could feel it through the bench, a faint vibration, strong and steady. "It is not a gentle process," he said. "The sound of it, bone and muscle rearranging, it is not pleasant." "I have heard worse," she said. "I once heard a kitchen girl drop a cauldron of boiling water on her own foot. The sound she made was not pleasant. I still helped her." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. A short, surprised sound, deep and warm, and it moved through the garden like something alive. She catalogued it immediately, filed it alongside his voice and his breathing and the creak of his leather coat. Cormac Vellanthor laughing. She intended to hear it again. "All right," he said. "I am going to stand. I am going to walk to the center of the garden. I am going to shift. And then I will come to you." She nodded. She heard him rise from the bench. She heard his boots on the frost-hardened ground, 3 paces, 4, 5. She heard the rustle of clothing being removed, the heavy wool coat, the tunic beneath, the boots. She heard him breathing, faster now, deeper, the rhythm of a body preparing for something enormous. And then she heard the shift. It was not like anything she had imagined. It was not the smooth, silent transformation of the stories the Omegas told in the kitchen. It was violent. It was visceral. She heard bone crack and reshape, heard muscle tear and reknit, heard the wet, dense sound of a body rebuilding itself from the inside out. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and it was the most astonishing sound she had ever heard. Not because it was beautiful, it was not, but because it was real, absolutely and undeniably real, the sound of a man becoming something else. Then silence. Then breath. Different breath. Deeper, slower, drawn through a larger chest and exhaled through a wider mouth. And then the sound of paws on frozen ground. Heavy paws. Each step was a soft, dense thud. Not the sharp click of a dog's nails, but the heavy, padded impact of something enormous moving with surprising care. He was coming toward her. She could hear the size of him in the weight of each step. She could smell him. The pine and smoke scent was stronger now, wilder, layered with something musky and animal and achingly warm. He stopped, in front of the bench, close. She could feel the heat of him, not the contained heat of a man in a coat, but the radiating furnace heat of a massive animal pouring off him in waves. She raised her hands. "May I?" A sound, not a word. Wolves could not speak, but a low, rumbling exhalation. Approval, permission. Her hands found him. Fur. Dense, thick, unbelievably soft at the surface and coarse beneath. 2 layers. A soft undercoat and a rougher outer coat, designed for cold. She ran her hands across his muzzle, broad, wider than her 2 hands, side by side, the nose large and damp and warm. She traced the line of his jaw, heavy, powerful, the bone beneath the fur thick and strong. She moved her hands up over the broad plane of his forehead, between the ears, tall, pointed, swiveling toward her touch, and down the back of his massive skull to the neck. The neck was enormous. Her arms could not reach around it. The muscle beneath the fur was dense and layered, like rope wound around rope, and the fur here was the thickest, a heavy ruff that she buried her fingers in and felt the warmth of his skin beneath. She moved to the shoulders. They were higher than her head. She was standing now, having risen from the bench without thinking, and her hands were moving across the vast architecture of his body, the high ridge of his spine, the broad slab of his ribcage expanding and contracting with each breath, the powerful haunches, the thick tail. He was enormous. She had heard that wolves were large, the shifted alphas were said to be the size of horses, but hearing it and feeling it were different things entirely. She was standing next to a creature that could have swallowed her whole, and his nose was pressed gently against her shoulder, and his breath was warm on her neck, and his heartbeat, she could feel it through the fur, through the muscle, through the bone, was steady and strong and slow. "You are beautiful," she said, and the word was insufficient, and she did not care. She pressed her face into the thick fur of his neck and breathed in the scent of him, wild and warm and vast, and the wolf made a sound that was not a growl and not a whine, but somewhere between, a low vibration that moved through his body and into hers. She stayed like that for a long time, her arms in his fur, his nose on her shoulder, the falls humming in the distance and the frost melting under the heat of him, and the rowan tree standing bare and patient above them both. When he shifted back, she turned away, not from modesty, she could not see, but to give him the privacy of a body remaking itself. She heard the crack and reshape again, and then the rustle of clothing, and then his voice, his human voice, low and rough and slightly breathless. "Well," he said. "Your ears are extraordinary," she said. "I could have spent an hour on just the ears." He laughed again, the second laugh. She was keeping count. Winter settled over Vellanthor like a held breath. The falls froze in sheets. Seren could hear the change in their voice, the deep hum shifting to a higher, thinner note as the water crystallized. The snow came and the hold grew quieter, the sounds muffled and softened the way sounds always are when the world is wrapped in white. Seren did not mind the cold. She had been cold her entire life. The difference was that now, when she was cold, there was somewhere warm to go. She was learning the hold the way she learned everything. Systematically, patiently, by touch and sound and repetition. She could walk from her rooms to the great hall without guidance. She could find the kitchen, larger than Blackridge's, warmer, staffed by people who said good morning when she entered. She could find the garden, even under snow and the rowan tree, its bare branches clicking in the wind like bones. And she was learning Cormac, not just his voice and his scent and the weight of his step, but the rhythms beneath, the way his breathing changed when he was worried, the way his hands went still when he was angry, the way he fell quiet before saying something important, as though the words needed a moment of silence to gather themselves. She learned that he slept poorly. She could hear him through the wall, not restless, not thrashing, but awake, breathing in the dark. She would press her palm against the wall and feel the faint vibration of his movement, and she would stay there, her hand on the stone, until his breathing slowed and she knew he was asleep. One night in the deep of winter, she heard something else through the wall, not wakefulness, not breathing. A sound, low, broken, muffled, the sound of a man pressing his face into something to keep from being heard. She rose from her bed. She unbolted her door. She crossed the corridor in the dark that was no different for her than the light, and she stood outside his door and listened. He was weeping, not loudly, not dramatically, the quiet, contained weeping of a man who had learned that grief was a private thing to be endured alone. Behind doors, in the dark, she could hear him trying to stop, the sharp, caught breaths, the clenched jaw silence, the effort of a man fighting his own body. She knocked. 2 steady raps, the way he always knocked on hers. "Cormac," she said. "It is Seren. May I come in?" Silence. A long silence, thick with the effort of composure. "You should not." His voice was rough, scraped raw. "May I come in?" she said again. The bolt slid open. She heard it from the other side of the door, and the heavy iron mechanism, the same as hers. He had bolted himself in. He had given himself the same courtesy he had given her. She pushed the door open. She stepped inside. The room smelled like his, pine and smoke and warmth, but underneath, the sharp salt smell of tears. She found him by sound. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. She could hear his breathing, ragged, tight, the breathing of a man who had been caught at something he did not want to be caught at. She sat beside him, not touching, close enough that he could feel her warmth, the way she had felt his in the cellar. She said nothing. She simply sat. After a while, his breathing steadied. He exhaled. That same exhale, the one from the cellar, the sound of a man setting something down. "My mother," he said. "She died in the autumn 4 years ago. The anniversary was today. I thought I was—" He stopped. She heard him swallow. "I thought I was past it." "You are not past it," she said. "You are in it. Those are different things." He was quiet for a long time. She could feel the heat of him beside her, and she could hear the fire dying in his hearth, and she could hear the falls through the frozen window, thin and high and constant, the only thing in Vellanthor that never stopped. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you sit in the dark with someone and know exactly what they need?" "I have spent my entire life in the dark," she said. "I know what it sounds like when someone needs company." She felt his hand find hers. Not a grab, a slow, deliberate reach, his fingers finding her wrist and tracing down to her hand and lacing through her fingers. She let him hold on. She held on back. They sat like that until the fire went out and the cold crept in, and his breathing was steady and slow. Then she squeezed his hand once, stood, and walked back to her rooms. She bolted her door. She pressed her palm against the wall. On the other side, she heard him exhale. The trouble came in late winter, when the snow was deepest and the roads were closed, and Odin Blackridge should not have been able to reach Vellanthor at all. But he came. Seren heard the commotion from the garden. She had taken to sitting on the bench beneath the rowan, even in the snow, wrapped in furs, listening to the winter birds. And the sound of it was wrong. Voices pitched too high, the heavy, rapid bootsteps of guards moving with purpose rather than routine. And beneath it all, a voice she knew, thin, sharp, controlled, the voice of a man who had locked her in a cellar and told her to stay quiet. "He is here," she said to Petra, who was beside her, wrapping dried herbs in linen. "Who?" Petra asked, but Seren was already moving, her hand on the garden wall, counting paces to the door. She did not need to answer. She heard Petra's breath catch. The older woman had recognized the voice too, a moment later, and her hand found Seren's arm. "Stay here," Petra said. "Let the king handle—" "No," Seren said, and she walked toward the sound. She found the great hall by the noise. The doors were open. She could feel the draft. Inside, many voices, all speaking at once, and above them, Odin's voice, sharp and carrying. A formal challenge to the claim. She was hidden for cause. The girl is defective, unfit, a burden on the high seat. No binding has been made. The claiming can be dissolved under the old law if the Omega is found to be— "Choose your next word very carefully, Blackridge," Cormac's voice. The hall went silent. Seren stood in the doorway and felt the silence press against her skin, and she could feel the tension in the room. A vibration, a frequency that her body read, the way sighted people read expressions. "Your Majesty." Odin's voice had shifted. Lower, more careful, the voice of a man recalculating. "I mean no disrespect. I speak only of law. The old laws are clear. An Omega claimed in error may be returned to her pack if she is found unfit. The girl cannot see. She cannot fulfill the duties of—" "She is standing in the doorway," Cormac said. "You may address her directly." Seren felt every head in the room turn toward her. She stood straight. Her chin was level. Her milky, sightless eyes were open and aimed at the direction of Odin's voice, and she did not flinch because she had spent 22 years learning how to stand in a room full of people who did not want to look at her, and she had learned that the trick was not to make them comfortable, but to make herself unafraid. "Seren," Odin said. The word was flat. Her name in his mouth was a label, nothing more. "You know this is for the best. You know you cannot be what the high seat requires. Come home. Come back to Blackridge. We will take care of you, as we always—" "You locked me in a cellar," she said. The hall went quiet again. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of shame. The particular, heavy silence that falls when a truth is spoken, that everyone knew but no one had said. "You locked me in a root cellar with a stool and a blanket and a door that latched from the outside, and you told me to be quiet while every other Omega in Blackridge was given the chance I was denied. You did not take care of me, Alpha Blackridge. You hid me, because you were ashamed." Her voice was steady. She was surprised by this. She had expected it to shake, expected the old training, the kitchen girl training, the be quiet training, the don't be trouble training, to rise up and silence her. But the training did not come. Something else came instead. Something that had been growing in her since the day Cormac said her name in the dark, and her name had sounded, for the first time, like it belonged to someone who mattered. You were ashamed of me because I am blind, she continued. You hid me because a blind Omega in your hall might make the Alpha King think less of your pack. You did not consider that a blind Omega locked in your cellar might make the Alpha King think less of you. She heard Odern's breath, short, sharp, the breath of a man who has been struck. She heard something else, too. From the left side of the hall, near the hearth, a low, choked sound. Someone laughing, trying not to. She filed the sound away and continued. I am not returning to Blackridge. I am not property. The old law you cite requires the Omega's consent to dissolve the claim, and I do not consent. I was claimed by the Alpha King in accordance with the King's law, and I will stand beside him, or not as I choose, not as you decide for me. You do not get to lock me in a dark room and then tell me that the dark is where I belong. Silence. Long. The fire cracked. The falls hummed through the walls. Then Cormac spoke. His voice was quiet and very, very warm. You have your answer, Blackridge. This is not. You have your answer, and you have the terms of my judgment, which I will render now. Cormac's voice did not change in volume. You hid an Omega of age from the claiming ceremony. You denied her the rights afforded by the King's law. You confined her without cause and without her consent. These are violations, Blackridge. Serious ones. Your Majesty, your title is stripped. Your lands are forfeit to the crown. You will be permitted to remain in Blackridge as a landholder under a steward of my choosing, or you may leave the Northern Territories entirely. The choice is yours, but you will never again have authority over another living soul in my domain. The sound that Odern made was not a word. It was a compressed, airless noise, the sound of a man's world collapsing inward. Seren heard his boots on the flagstone, unsteady, stumbling, and then the great hall doors groaned and the draft shifted, and he was gone. The hall erupted. Voices all at once. Not whispers, but open sound. The sound of people who had watched a thing happen and needed to process it immediately. Seren stood in the doorway and let the noise wash over her. She was shaking. Not from fear. From the aftershock of saying the things she had carried in her chest for 22 years. The things she had never been permitted to say. The truth that no one had wanted to hear. Then Cormac was beside her. She knew it before he touched her. The scent of pine and smoke, the warmth radiating from his body, the weight of his step. He did not take her hand. He stood beside her and let her feel his presence, and he waited. I would like to go to the garden, she said. Of course, he said. They walked together through the hold. He did not speak. She did not speak. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, the way a room is full of warmth even when no one is talking. He walked at her pace, and she held his arm, and they went to the garden and sat on the bench beneath the rowan in the snow. And the falls hummed, and the winter birds called, and the world was very quiet and very still. You did not need me in there, he said finally. No, she said. I was prepared to. I know. You were extraordinary. She leaned against him, just slightly, her shoulder against his arm. The first time she had initiated contact, she felt him go still, the way a man goes still when something precious has landed on his hand and he does not want to startle it. You gave me a room with a bolt on the inside, she said. You described herons to me. You brought Petra. You let me touch your wolf, and you laughed when I said your ears were extraordinary. She turned her face toward him, her sightless eyes aimed at his voice. You did not make me brave, Cormac, but you made a world where being brave was possible. His hand found hers, his fingers laced through hers. His pulse was faster than usual, and she could feel the warmth of it, and the strength of it, and the steady, undeniable reality of a man who had walked into a dark cellar and found her and spoken her name and changed everything. They sat on the bench in the snow, and the falls shook the walls, and neither of them moved. Spring came to Vellanthor in sound. Seren heard it before anyone told her. The falls changed first. The thin, high note of frozen water deepened, cracked, and then roared back to life as the ice broke and the meltwater came down from the gray peaks in a torrent that shook the walls and rattled the windows and filled the hold with a sound so vast and constant that conversations had to be held at close range. Then the birds, not the sparse, sharp calls of winter, the few stubborn species that stayed through the cold, but a rising tide of song, building day by day, a chorus that started before dawn and did not stop until dark. Seren sat at her open window and let the sound pour over her, and she identified each voice as it returned. The high trill of the warbler, the repeating note of the thrush, the low, liquid call of something she could not name, that Cormac later told her was a blackbird. Then the garden. She smelled it, the rich, dark scent of earth warming under the sun, the first green shoots pushing through the thawed soil. She went to the rowan tree and pressed her hand against the trunk and felt the change. The bark was warmer than it had been in months, warm all the way around now, not just on the south side, and beneath her palm she could feel a faint vibration. The sap rising, Petra told her. The tree was waking up. She was waking up too. The months at Vellanthor had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She moved differently, not the careful, contained movement of a blind girl navigating a hostile kitchen, but the sure, unhurried stride of a woman who knew where she was going. She spoke differently. She laughed. She laughed a great deal, actually. With Petra, whose dry observations about the hold's inhabitants kept Seren in stitches. With Fen, whose quiet, understated humor surfaced unexpectedly. And with Cormac, who was funnier than he knew and who made a sound when he laughed, deep, surprised, almost reluctant, that she had decided was her favorite sound in the world. She had been keeping count. 47 laughs. She was aiming for 100 by midsummer. One evening, as the last snow was melting and the garden was beginning to green, Cormac came to her door earlier than usual. She heard the knock, his knock, always the same, 2 steady raps, and she unbolted the door and found him standing in the corridor, smelling of pine and cold air and something else, something sweet and alive. "Come to the garden," he said. "There is something I want you to hear." She took his arm. They walked through the hold. She knew every step now, every turn, every change in the flagstone's texture beneath her feet. And they reached the garden door, and he opened it, and the sound that came through was so rich and layered that she stopped in the doorway and could not move. Bees, dozens of them, humming in the new blossoms, and birds closer than she had heard them all winter, singing from branches that were no longer bare. And water, not the falls, which were always there, but a smaller, more intimate sound. A trickle, close and musical. And beneath it all, the deep, patient creak of the rowan tree's branches, heavy with new leaves, moving in a warm wind. "The fountain," Cormac said. "It starts again in spring. The snow melt feeds it through a channel in the wall." He led her to it. Her hands found the stone basin, broad, shallow, rough with age, and the water that flowed into it, cold and clean and tasting of mountain snow when she cupped it in her palm and lifted it to her lips. "And the rowan," he said. He guided her hand to the lowest branch. Her fingers found leaves, new, soft, unfurled, as different from the bare branches she had touched all winter as silk is from bone. She laughed. She could not help it. The leaves were so soft, so impossibly new, and the bees were humming, and the fountain was singing, and the world was so full of sound and warmth and life that her chest could barely contain it. "Seren," Cormac said. She turned toward his voice. He was close, closer than he usually stood. She could feel his warmth, the expansion of his chest as he breathed, the faint tremor in his hand where it held hers. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that the answer can be no. The answer can be not yet. The answer can be anything you need it to be, and it will not change what I have promised you. The room, the garden, the bolt on the door. Those are yours regardless." She waited. She could hear his heart. It was faster than usual. Cormac Vellanthor, whose voice moved through stone, whose wolf was the size of a horse, whose presence could silence a hall. His heart was beating fast. "Will you bind with me?" he asked. "Not because the bond demands it, not because the law expects it, but because I have sat beside you in the garden every day for 6 months, and you have made me laugh and made me weep and made me describe a heron for 20 minutes, and I cannot imagine the rest of my life without the sound of your voice in it." Serene's eyes were open. They were aimed at nothing, the way they always were, and they were filling with tears that she could feel but could not see. "I have a condition," she said. "Name it. At the ceremony, whatever words are spoken, I want to hear them. I want to hear every word clearly, without anyone whispering them to me or translating them for me or speaking on my behalf. I want to stand in front of your people and hear the binding words and say them myself." "Of course," he said. "Of course. And I want Petra beside me." "Yes. And I want to touch the rowan tree first, before we go to the hall. I want to stand here, in this garden, with my hand on the bark, and feel the sun on my face, because this is where I learned that the world was bigger than a cellar. This is where I became someone who could say yes to you." He was quiet. She could hear his breathing, unsteady now, the breathing of a man who is holding himself together with effort. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough. "Then yes," she said. "I will bind with you." The binding was held on the first day of true spring, when the falls were at their loudest and the garden was in full bloom, and the rowan tree was so heavy with new leaves that its branches touched the ground. Seren stood in the garden first, as she had asked. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, the color of the sky, Petra told her, though Seren had never seen the sky and took it on faith, with silver thread at the cuffs and hem, and her dark brown hair fell in loose waves that Petra had braided and that had already begun to come undone. She put her hand on the rowan tree's trunk. The bark was warm and ridged and alive beneath her palm. She felt the sun on her face, warm, golden, directionless, and she tilted her chin up and breathed in the smell of blossoms and new earth and the faint mist from the falls, and she stood there until she was ready. Then they went to the great hall. The hall was full. She could hear it, the vast layered hum of many people, the creak of benches, the shuffle of boots, the low murmur of voices that fell silent as she entered. She walked on Petra's arm. Cormac was at the far end of the hall. She could feel him there, his presence pulling at her the way the sun pulled at a plant, directionless and warm and impossible to mistake for anything else. She walked the length of the hall, 63 paces. She counted, and each pace was steady and sure and her own. When she reached him, he took her hand. His palm was rough and warm and familiar. His heartbeat was fast again, but steady. The fast heartbeat of a man who is not afraid, but is feeling something enormous. The elder spoke the binding words. Seren heard every one of them, clear, old, heavy with the weight of the tradition they carried. She repeated her own words when the time came, and her voice was steady, and it carried through the hall the way Cormac's voice carried through stone, not with volume, but with weight. When it was done, Cormac leaned toward her. She felt his breath on her face, warm and close, and his hand came up to her jaw, gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and he kissed her. It was the first kiss, gentle and slow and thorough, and it tasted of something she could not name, but would later decide was the taste of being chosen. The hall erupted. Sound, cheering, stomping, the raw, unself-conscious noise of people who were happy and did not care who heard it. Seren stood in the center of it and felt the sound wash over her like water, and she smiled, and the smile was so wide that it used muscles she had not known she had. That night, she lay beside him in the bed that was now theirs, in the room where the falls shook the window and the bolt on the door was thrown from the inside. Not to keep anyone out this time, but because the habit of safety had become a kind of peace. His arm was around her. His chest was warm against her back. His breathing was slow and deep, and his heartbeat was steady, and the room was dark and full and safe. "Cormac," she said, "yes." "Tell me what the moonlight looks like, on the falls." She felt him shift. She felt him turn toward the window. She could not see the moonlight, would never see it, but she could hear the falls roaring in the dark, and she could feel the faint mist on the air, and she could feel his chest expand as he prepared to describe a thing that most people would not think to describe, because most people took the miracle of sight for granted. "It is silver," he said. "The water is black, and the moonlight turns it silver where it catches the surface. There are 1,000 silver threads falling from the cliff, and the mist at the bottom glows, like a cloud made of light, like the water is dissolving into the moon." She pressed her back against his chest. She closed her sightless eyes and saw it, not with her eyes, which had never worked, but with the place behind her ribs where she kept all the things he had given her: the heron, the river, the amber, the wolf's fur, the rowan tree's bark, the sound of his laugh, 48 times now, and now the moonlight on the falls, silver threads on black water, dissolving into light. "Beautiful," she said. His arm tightened around her. The falls roared. The room was dark, and in the dark, which was where she had always lived, Seren was finally, completely, impossibly home,